In the 1990s, large numbers of dead fish began periodically washing up on the shores of Lake Erie. Following the fish were scores of dead seabirds. The local scientists quickly converged on the lake, taking all kinds of samples in an attempt to discover the reason for all the deaths. Interestingly, the cause of death nearly across the board seemed to be drowning. How is it possible that aquatic birds and fish could drown? These are organisms specifically evolved to live in water. And why so many all at once? Each answer led to more questions. Eventually, the data points started to come together. The water at the bottom of the lake had an abnormally low oxygen content, called anoxia, for an abnormally long time. The dead and dying fish were all paralyzed. Unable to move, they couldn't swim out of the anoxic waters or away from predators. The smaller paralyzed fish were easy prey for larger fish and birds. The fish and birds that ate these fish also showed signs of paralysis. Unable to keep their heads above the surface, the birds drowned as well. All this evidence pointed to an outbreak of one very dangerous bacterium, Clostridium botulinum. Clostridium botulinum is an obligate, anaerobic, gram-positive, endospore-forming, rod-shaped bacteria that can cause a very deadly form of food poisoning. Let's break that down a little bit. C. botulinum is an obligate anaerobe, meaning it cannot survive in the presence of oxygen and can only grow by fermentation in anoxic environments. The bacterium is gram-positive, meaning it has a thick peptidoglycan cell wall. It also forms very resistant endospores that are able to survive unfavorable environmental conditions. These endospores are everywhere. If you brush your hand across the desk in front of you and examine the dust you stirred up, it would contain C. botulinum endospores. These endospores will only become active growing bacteria if they land in an anoxic, protein-rich environment. With this information, the Lake Erie outbreak starts to make more sense. The bacteria were able to grow in the abnormally anoxic waters. They were passed up through the food chain, first infecting fish, then fish-eating birds. But why were the infected animals paralyzed? C. botulinum produces a very potent exotoxin. An exotoxin is a toxin that is produced by, in this case, a bacterial cell and released into the environment around the cell. The botulism exotoxin is only released by the vegetative, meaning actively growing, bacteria and is the most potent and deadly natural substance known. 1 gram of aerosolized botulism toxin is enough to kill about 1 million people. Toxic doses are measured in billionths of a gram. So, how does this toxin work? Well, the Lake Erie outbreak provides some clues, with the major clue being the paralysis experienced by fish and birds. Botulism toxin is a potent neurotoxin that interferes with the neurotransmitters that pass signals from the nerves to the muscles. The toxin blocks the release of acetylcholine from the nerves. Normally, acetylcholine is released from the nerve cells and binds to the muscles, initiating contractions. When the botulism neurotoxin blocks acetylcholine release, this results in flaccid paralysis, which means the muscles are limp and unable to contract. Aquatic animals that can't move their muscles will drown, just like the fish and birds in Lake Erie. But this is a lesson about food poisoning. So, with this background in place, let's shift our focus to humans. Since C. botulinum endospores are everywhere, it is inevitable that they will contaminate food. You might think that if the endospores are everywhere and that so little of the toxin is required to be lethal, why aren't large numbers of people dying from botulism every day? The answer, again, lies in the organism itself. The endospores require very specific anaerobic and protein-rich conditions to germinate into growing cells and produce toxins. Foods that are processed with high heat or acids will kill C. botulinum. Exposure to oxygen prevents the endospores from germinating and producing toxins. The toxin itself is simply a protein, so heating foods to 80 to 90 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes is enough to break down any toxin proteins already present in the food, rendering it harmless. It is important to note here that illness is caused by the toxin, not the bacteria itself. C. botulinum that are unable to produce the exotoxin are harmless. And even if the cells aren't actively growing, residual toxin can result in illness. Problems arise when the safeguards for food preservation and preparation are not followed and people consume the toxin. It has become much less common today, but many people used to can their own vegetables. Failure to properly heat sterilize vegetables can allow C. botulinum to survive. Some canned veggies, like beans, are often used cold and uncooked in salads. Eating them without heating them to the required 80 to 90 degrees Celsius can result in botulism toxin consumption. Of course, commercially canned foods can also be contaminated with endospores, but regulations ensure more consistent handling and processing, thus reducing infections from this source. Still, any dented or damaged cans should be discarded, and you should never taste test these foods. Often, fresh fish are smoked and vacuum sealed in plastic. The process of smoking is unable to completely eliminate the endospores, so this anaerobic, protein-rich environment can also harbor C. botulinum. Eating this fish without cooking it can lead to botulism food poisoning. Botulism can infect anyone that ingests the toxins, but infant botulism is the most common type. Infants under 6 months of age have underdeveloped immune systems and intestinal flora, or the protective microbial population living in the intestine. Any C. botulinum endospores that are consumed by infants have a greater chance of germinating and producing toxins. Since the endospores are everywhere, it is impossible to completely safeguard your baby. Still, cases of infant botulism are rare. In fact, in most cases, infant botulism occurs because the baby was fed raw honey. Raw honey contains a higher concentration of botulism endospores. The adult immune system and intestinal flora are able to eliminate these endospores, but in infants they can germinate and cause disease. There are still about 150 cases a year in the United States, but due to prompt treatment and improving technology, fatalities are under 5%. Simply not feeding raw honey to babies under the age of 1 year, or even up to 2 years, is enough to prevent most cases. We know that botulism toxin causes paralysis, but let's start at the beginning and trace the progress of a case of food poisoning. At first, the toxin is ingested, moving through the digestive system. From here, it is absorbed into the bloodstream, where it can travel throughout the body. Initially, the toxin affects the muscles of the head. People experience blurred vision, drooping eyelids, eye twitches, difficulty swallowing, and slurred speech. Babies will often have no muscle tone, be lethargic, constipated, and nurse and cry weakly. This state is often called floppy baby syndrome. Eventually, the paralysis spreads to the rest of the body. Death usually results from suffocation due to paralysis of the diaphragm, or cardiac arrest due to paralysis of the heart. Treatment is available but must be done quickly. There is an antitoxin that blocks the effects of the exotoxin. Often, in addition to the antitoxin, patients are put on life support. Mechanical respirators can keep a person alive and breathing long enough for the body to eliminate the toxin on its own. Full recovery can take up to a year. Let's take a minute and review. Clostridium botulinum is an obligate, anaerobic, gram-positive, endospore-forming, rod-shaped bacteria that can cause a very deadly form of food poisoning. C. botulinum produces endospores that are found everywhere in the environment, but these endospores can only germinate in anaerobic, protein-rich conditions. Vegetative cells release an exotoxin that is a very potent neurotoxin. The toxin blocks the release of acetylcholine from the nerves, preventing muscle contractions. This leads to flaccid paralysis, characterized by muscles that are limp and unable to contract. Paralysis usually begins with the muscles of the head and eyes before progressing to the rest of the body. Death occurs by cardiac arrest or suffocation due to paralysis of the heart and diaphragm, respectively. Adults usually acquire botulism by eating foods that were improperly canned or not cooked following canning. Infants usually acquire botulism by eating raw honey. Prevention includes heating foods to 80 to 90 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes and not feeding raw honey to babies under 1 year of age.